Okay. All right. This is Theory of Change. Welcome, everybody. We're live here with a live show on Theory of Change, as I just redundantly said. We're doing something a bit different today. We're going to have a discussion about what if the Donald Trump years, if we're able to still have a republic after his administration is done, what if we could think of these 10 years of Trump, since it's been 10 years, of him as a lost decade for the United States. And joining me to discuss this subject in pretty great detail, hopefully, is Paul Campos. He's a law professor at the University of Colorado. And both of the gentlemen here with me today are writers at the Lawyers, Guns, and Money blog. And Erik Loomis is a history professor at the University of Rhode Island. And Paul recently wrote a post that got me thinking about the nature of what Trump has been doing. And, you know, when you think about it, Trump has, to a large degree, you know, the controversies that got Donald Trump elected, he's done nothing about them. Basically, the reason he got elected was because nobody in either political party really addressed them, whether they were structural inequality problems, whether they were, you know, cultural resentments and divides, and whether, you know, and the sort of, you know, the deindustrialization of America. He's, you know, with some, by and large, done nothing to solve any of these problems that got him elected. Although one could say that perhaps in his brain, he thinks he has done so with these tariffs that he's put into place. And so, but the other unfortunate paradox is that the Trump years have also seemingly, the Democrats have also stood in place just in the same way that the nation of Japan during the 1990s and perhaps a little bit after that was widely observed, or I guess a lot of people seem to use the phrase the lost decade of the 90s in Japan, where they had made a lot of progress in the post-war era. And then things kind of got really, you know, stagnated in the 1990s, and nobody necessarily was trying to go for stagnation. But I think the difference here with Trump is, in some ways, I think he is kind of doing a stagnation. Anyway, but there's a lot to unpack there. So why don't we start off with you, Paul? Maybe you can, if you want to, intro your post a little bit about and make some of the arguments you made, and then maybe address one or anything that I said there.
Yeah, I wrote a post on Monday, which is the 10th anniversary of Trump announcing his initial run for the presidency. And I was just noting there that at the time, nobody took it seriously. And for many months afterwards, nobody took it seriously. Even after all the polls showed that Trump had a big lead in the Republican primary, this was just assumed to be name recognition. And since it was just obviously ridiculous that the idea of him being elected president, surely he was going to go away. And I suggested at the time that there were reasons to think that Trump actually could be elected president. And I remember the post that I put up on LGM about that drew 100% condemnation, if I recall correctly, from the commenters, who all said I was a complete idiot to think such a thing. So I point that out every couple or 3 days, I guess, sometimes on LGM. And I've made a lot of bad predictions, so that was a good one. Anyway, what I really was doing with the thread was to give people a chance to just ruminate a little bit about what 10 years of Trumpism has meant to them, especially in a context in which I think now, as we're beginning to get a little bit of remove from the Biden administration, I think we're going to see the Biden administration historically as this kind of interregnum, basically, in which it was a discontinuity within a historical arc, which is going to be essentially defined by Trump and the movement that he represents politically. And one thing I wanted to suggest in the context of that post is that we're still sort of beginning to put our hands around and our minds around what Trump is and what Trumpism is all about, which is hard to do in the midst of things, as I'm sure Erik has a better sense than I do as a professional historian. But I mean, I guess I would say that in response to your comments, I think the response of the Democratic Party in many ways has been understandable. The response institutionally was essentially Trump is just this catastrophe, both as a person and as a political phenomenon, and we just have to get rid of him. I think that has been the sort of guiding principle of the Democratic Party over the last 10 years. As I say, I think that's understandable, but I think that's also been unfortunate for a couple of reasons. One, reasons that probably Erik can expand on more than I can, having to do with the lack of any more sort of coherent vision beyond the absolute necessity of getting rid of Trump. And the other reason being that a lot of those tactics and strategies that were used to get rid of Trump were, to put it mildly, somewhat suboptimal in retrospect. So that's kind of what I wanted to bring, to the discussion, and I hope that we can sort of expand on those themes today.
You want me to go here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that there are. I mean, there's a number of issues here that I think Paul is right about. I mean, to me, I think that the real mistake that a lot of people have made is that, look, like this was coming for a long, long time. I mean, Republican voters were dying for an outsider candidate like Donald Trump. I mean, we kind of, I think, have developed this vision of the Republican Party in the 90s as, the party of George Bush and Bob Dole and like people who were conservative but not crazy. But this really is, this really forgets this kind of grassroots anger that was already, popping up very, very deeply in the Republican Party. And if you look back at the, 5 or so election cycles before 2016, there's all of these efforts for these weird outsider candidates to get the nomination, right? Really starting with, in a sense, starting with Pat Robertson in 88, and then Pat Buchanan in 96. I remember did my master's degree at the University of Tennessee and trying to do research on my master's thesis in the archives there. The archivist there, like, basically spent the entire time I was in there to all of her friends talking about how only Pat Buchanan could save America. So it was great for research. But and then after that, Michelle Bachmann and Ben Carson and Herman Cain and all of these weirdos, all of who had these bumps that were pretty legitimate. So, looking back, we shouldn't be a bit surprised that somebody like Donald Trump would be able to take over the Republican Party, right? That this is this kind of post civil rights, post Reagan populism, deeply embedded in conspiracy theories and racism and nostalgia was an upsurge in the party for 20 or more years, 30 years before this. So Donald Trump is really the culmination of a larger, whether you want to call it grassroots or astroturf movement in the Republican Party. And I think that's, if we're to begin to think about Donald Trump and begin to think about his impact, I think we have to put it in that historical context that looking back, we should not have been surprised that somebody like Trump can win. And I think we were all just kind of wish casting that he wouldn't. So, and I think in a post-Trump world, I think the Republican Party would have to lose for a long time, like 1930s level of losing, for this to go away. And this is something that is not going to be a 10-year interregnum, but rather, I think the reality of the rest of our lives is that the Republican Party is going to be an openly racist and quite right-wing extremist political party. Yeah,
I wanted to mention one name that Erik didn't, which is Sarah Palin, who I think was a really critical moment here. I have a book that I'm getting out called The Triumph of Stupidity, which has a chapter on Palin as a kind of Joan the Baptist to the whole Trumpist moment. And I think the particular thing that Palin brought overtly to American politics that Trump, sort of kicked up to 11, was this kind of valorization of stupidity, just this kind of, I don't know anything. And it's great that I don't know anything because, it's a very fascist idea, essentially, right? That we should make decisions on the basis of instinct and impulse rather than rationality and experts who are all overrated and don't know what they're talking about. I think the parallels between Palin and Trump are really interesting. Although obviously there are some crucial differences as well. So anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there as another sort of piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's been a long time coming, and I think you could go even further back if you look at Barry Goldwater. I mean, in a lot of ways, Donald Trump is the candidate that Barry Goldwater and his supporters fantasized about. I think one could say that in many different ways, even though he was, he's and actually, I guess he's showing that, with his Iran invasion talk now, and going to war. But like a lot of people, as you guys at LGM are very astute in pointing out, and much earlier than I think a lot of other people did, that this idea that Donald Trump is some sort of dove is ludicrous, and it's always been ludicrous. Yeah. Like I think that's it's a really unfortunate viewpoint that a lot of people in the mainstream media, or even just outside of the MAGA cult movement, they didn't realize this, that just because you're an isolationist and you hate institutions, that doesn't mean that you don't love war also. And Donald Trump is showing that, and he's always shown that.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Paul. Go ahead, Paul.
Just quickly, there's an essential tension there, I think, in the Republican base between this isolationist strain and this and a militarism which is really doesn't really contradict the isolationism, but which is in a sort of paradoxical relationship with it often. And Trump, I think, represents that personally. I mean, he loves the idea of blowing stuff up, but at the same time, he is essentially an isolationist in one level of his thinking, and some of the people around him reflect that as well. So we're seeing a nice little fight in the Trump administration right now over what's going to happen with Iran, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way that Donald Trump is an isolationist is that he hates every other country, and he doesn't trust. He thinks everybody's an enemy, right? And I think you see this with the trade stuff. And to the, but his isolationism is also rooted in the fact that he doesn't really want America to have anything to do with the rest of the world in any way, really, if possible. But I think that the key to understanding Trump and his relationship with basically everybody in the nation is that so many people have kind of like a vested interest in not admitting what Donald Trump is. And that's across the political spectrum, right? That's from the American left, who, still wants to believe that the libs are the real problem and not Trump. And, you have former leftists like, Matt Taibbi and people like that who are basically, thinking that Trump is, at least if nothing else, sticking it to the libs, to the mainstream Democratic Party, who refuses to admit what this is, to the Beltway media, to what were theoretically more mainstream Republicans, to, these far-right figures who are amazed that Donald Trump would consider war. I mean, everybody is basically thinking that Donald Trump represents whatever they think about politics before Donald Trump came into power. And if the Trump years have shown anything to me, it's that nobody is willing to admit that their previous beliefs about politics are wrong. Right, Trump somehow gives them a way to double down on everything they believed before Donald Trump, and nothing is ever going to change this. And I think that is, in some ways, as disturbing as anything Donald Trump has offered. So the New York Times and Washington Post op-ed pages are going to say the same thing no matter what happens, as will DSA folks, as will Steve Bannon. I mean, it just doesn't seem to make any difference.
Yeah, but one thing that I think has actually been a positive development in really the last year or 18 months is this concept of sane washing, which I think is quite recent, or at least it seems to me to be. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But anyways, this whole concept,
it's a recent term, yeah.
Yeah, this kind of understanding now, kind of meta critique of the media and the cultural discourse, where people are pointing out that many people are heavily invested in continuing to do what Erik is talking about, which is to treat Trump as something other than this sort of completely sort of irrationalist burst of absurdity, and are just trying to put lipstick on a pig, basically, whatever their particular little political agendas might be. I think the most amusing or the horrifying example of this in the context of the first few months of the Trump administration were these sort of tremendous exertions to try to make RFK Jr. out to be something other than a total maniac. Somebody who's like, oh, well, he's against having potato chips in school lunches. So the fact that he thinks that, basically every crazy conspiracy theory of the last 30 years is true, except I think that the moon landing was faked, is somehow something we can just sort of overlook, because he does have like one or two good ideas. And I think that's just a sort of microcosm of the whole Trump era written large, that just all these sort of respectable institutional types are trying to make this out to be something other than what it is.
Yeah, I would say, on the RFK thing, I mean, one of the things that this has really driven home to me, and I'm thinking about writing about this, although I don't know if anybody would really want to hear this, is in the ways in which sort of like the crunchy personalist side of the environmental movement has so embraced RFK. And what that says to me about the decline of environmentalism as a social movement, and the ways in which that movement has sort of devolved from a kind of a, we need to protect ecosystems writ large and we need to protect humans writ large, to I am going to protect my body from these outside elements that is attacking my own purity, right? It's basically become, it's basically become Sterling Hayden at the, in Dr. Strangelove. And I think that's, and that's maybe the subject for a whole other podcast, but I think it again, what Trump does is it takes every social movement and it turns it into the worst version of itself, basically. And I think you see this to a different extent in the labor movement, and these are the two social movements that I most follow in terms of my scholarship, but especially with environmentalism. I mean, it's really showing an environmentalist movement that is fundamentally like extremely selfish, and extremely conspiracy oriented and extremely body fetishing. And I think that there's a lot of internal examination that needs to happen in a lot of social movements about what the influence of Trump and the people around him have had.
Yeah, because I think one thing that Trump does.
Actually,
go ahead.
Actually, do you mind? Can I just jump in real quick? So Erik, actually, I love that point, and actually, we did an episode on theory of change about that very thing. That there's basically so if anybody wants to look it up, there's an episode we did with Eric Oliver. He is a political scientist that has basically shown that there were two. We have all humans have two kinds of reasoning, basically our bodily reason, instinctual reason, and then our abstract reason. And he released this book that he wrote in 2018, and he basically predicted that all the RFK Jr. people would come into Trumpism because they have the same epistemology. And even if you look at history before, the anti-immigration movement actually is an outgrowth of the environmental movement. As a historical matter, but
there's a really fascinating sort of intersection there for me personally, in that I co-authored a paper with Oliver 20 years ago on the moral panic over obesity in the International Journal of Epidemiology, if anybody is interested in looking it up. And our argument touches a great deal on the notion that a lot of anxieties about obesity are driven precisely by this kind of, we didn't put it that way at the time, but this kind of quasi-fascistic anxiety about bodily purity and contamination, both of the body politic and the individual body. And I think what Erik is touching on, both Erik Loomis and Erik Oliver, is that there's a strong intersection between American fetishism about purity and bodily integrity and what Trump is tapping into. I don't think it's coincidental, by the way, that Trump himself seems to have this absolute phobia about any kind of germs or bodily contamination or something like that, because that's essentially a core fascistic impulse, both psychologically and aesthetically. So I find it very gratifying that these these sort of different streams have come together in a way.
Yeah, and it's in some ways the people have talked for a number of years about the political and geographic sorting of America, but now we're basically coming into epistemic sorting of America as well. And in some ways, that's a bad thing, though, for people who believe in science and reason, because a lot of people don't necessarily use that all the time in their thinking. And that's was one of the other things that the other Erik, who's not here, and I did discuss, is that with for Democrats, which is pertinent to this discussion as well, because like Democrats have also kind of been doing the exact same thing for the past 10 years with Trump, and which is also coincidentally the exact same thing that the Republican opponents that he had in 2016 were doing. That basically they all seem to think, and James Carville had recently said this just a few months ago, that all we have to do is just sit back and let him self-destruct, and then people will just be so horrified at all of this that they'll abandon him in droves, and all we have to, and then we can pick up the pieces and save America. I mean, this is literally the same thing they've all been doing. It's really discouraging and pretty gross.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the mainline Democratic Party power structure simply wants to believe this is all going to go away, and I think that's the again, I can complain about basically the response to Trump across the political spectrum, but within the Democratic Party's power structure, I mean, the fundamental belief is that this isn't real, right? That this is not, that we just have to get over this, and that really was the Biden administration's entire reason for existing, right? I mean, they just assuming that this was going to go away, and that now rationality was going to take over, and the grown-ups are back in the room, and that may be why Trump got elected. I mean, Biden was able to win in 2020, but that it doesn't have any legs. And one thing I've been pushing at Lawyers Guns and Money that has caused a lot of dislike among the commenters is the belief that the Democratic Party needs to have serious conversations right now, because it's entirely possible that if there is a free and fair election in 2028, that Democrats do win. I mean, they're gonna obviously take the House in 2026. And that's going to give a lot of Democrats a belief that we just keep doing the same things, that we're going to, that we'll win in 28. And that may or may not be true. The problem is that if you don't take the kind of grassroots side of this seriously, and you don't understand that people are dissatisfied with a system, even if it's for the stupidest possible reasons, but if that this discontent is not somehow channeled, then all you're going to see is another massive reaction to the right by 2030, and the rise of an even more fascist-oriented candidate by 2032 from the Republicans, with a very high likelihood of winning. In other words, you have to break the cycle. And the Democratic leadership, and Carville's stuff is a perfect example, but really Chuck Schumer is like the paragon of this, simply refuses to get their head around the fact that the American politics have permanently changed, and the approach that the Democrats have to take to American politics must also permanently change. And those are conversations that people just don't even want to have right now.
Yeah, and I think a huge problem here is something that we've touched on quite a bit at LGM, which is just the problem of gerontocracy. Basically, it's extraordinarily difficult for old people to believe, and I say this myself as an old person, right? I'm 65, so I'm young by Democratic, elite standards, but old by human being standards.
Paul, you're just the right age to run as a freshman senator.
I know, right?
That's
I'm just or a pope, basically. Those are like the two categories where I'm still reasonably young. But anyway, it's just extraordinarily difficult for old people to genuinely believe that the world has shifted fundamentally from what it was when they were young. I mean, I'm not saying that people aren't capable of doing that, but it's very, very difficult. So somebody like Bernie Sanders is very old, but Bernie Sanders basically has the same beliefs that he had 50 years ago, right? It's just he's carried it out to the present, just as Chuck Schumer does, just as Joe Biden does, just as Nancy Pelosi did, et cetera. And all these people, definitely very much have their virtues and did a lot to battle against Trump. But what they definitely did not do was grasp the enormity of the political change that has taken place in America. Instead, seeing Trump, as Erik says, as this kind of one-off aberration that would just basically go away when the fever broke, as it were. And I mean, at this point, I think it's safe to say that hypothesis has been demolished.
Yeah, and I think you see this with the approach that Democrats have taken. I mean, to talk about one well-known incident, right? When Nancy Pelosi intervenes in the House to ensure that Jerry Connolly, an old man with cancer, who is soon to die, is the head of, the Oversight Committee, I guess, versus instead of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And it's this kind of belief that, the seniority is what really matters here. And I don't have anything negative to say about Connolly per se. I don't even, he's just not that well known outside of inter-Democratic Party circles. So it's not a critique of him per se, except that he was ancient and about to die of cancer, and yet the entire structure of the Democratic Party has to intervene to assure that the seniority principle must be held at all times. Totally missing the point of how you're going to win in the future and building the kind of power and the kind of figures necessary to be able to engage in the messaging to the American public necessary to counter Trumpism. And again, it's just this massive cluelessness or unwillingness to recognize what America's become that continues to drive enormous pieces of the Democratic Party. And maybe that is slowly changing. I mean, if you look at the Democratic senators who are retiring, instead of running for re-election, and people like Shaheen and Gary Peters and especially Dick Durbin are all these tremendous institutionalists. And so maybe we're finally starting to see that slow change develop, but at a rate far too slow to counter the kind of rapid transitions that the Republican Party is engaging in America.
Yeah. And I would say, I mean, the younger ones, across whatever their ideologies are, they have a much better grasp on this. Like whether, you look at Brian Schatz or, the younger Democratic senators, that he's just one that comes to mind. But,
Well, and if I could build off that briefly, I think that's
sure.
critical here. I mean, one thing about discussions of within a broad left liberal coalition, to the extent that a left liberal coalition really even exists in this country, is that, and I've said this for a long time now, like 20 years, that, at every election cycle, whatever happens is just going to reinforce your opinion of Democrats, right? So, like, again, no one will ever change their opinion on the Democratic Party because of their pre-existing beliefs and whatever. But I think that, and that was true after 2024 as well. But I think the actual divide in the Republican Party, the Democratic Party right now, is for once not actually that much about policy. Yes, third way people are saying the only way Democrats have a road back is to adopt, Clintonian policies. And the left is saying the same thing, except to adopt Bernie policies. But it seems to me the actual divide is much more about messaging and fighting than it is about policy. That's the real division. And that's very much an age-related division.
Yeah. And I think you definitely saw that just in the past, week and a half or so, with particularly with the No Kings rally, that the Democratic voter base, regardless of what their ideology is, so whether they align more with Sanders or whether they align more with somebody who's more centrist, they just want the Democrats to fight and to be out there a lot more and to not be afraid to say something. And when they do, and when Democrats do that, they get support. I mean, it's that simple. And instead we see within inside the Beltway, there's this discussion right now about this book that's recently come out. It's by Ezra Klein and Derek Robertson, I think is his name, over at the Atlantic. or Derek Thompson, sorry, that called abundance. Like they just have these endless discussions about policy, but the voters don't even know what the policies are. And so, because they're surrounded by right-wing media, like if you live in Arkansas or something, and you're not political, you go to right-wing media is the mainstream media for you. You go down to the bar, they got Fox News on. Like you can't get away from right-wing media.
If I could be like, indulge in sort of the academic fantasy of power, one thing I would do is I would like subject a lot of the Democratic leadership class and the Democratic pundit class to some kind of like Ludovico treatment, where they would be forced to watch like Fox News and some right-wing hate radio and some mega church sermons of a political nature, et cetera, for like an hour or two to begin to grasp what people are actually listening to, instead of like knowing about it in this kind of vague, abstract way. Because every time that I watch Fox News for like 5 minutes, I'm just reminded just by this kind of slap in the face that this is what these people are listening to. And they're getting this, 24/7. And what you have is this kind of essentially moronicized electorate, which I think is something that is very, very difficult to grapple with if you are someone who's trying to come up with a political rhetorical strategy, because obviously you can't go to the voters and say, look, you guys, you're a bunch of idiots. So you just stop watching what you're watching, stop scrolling the gram or whatever, and let the intelligent policy people make the decisions. I think that's sort of the background sort of default assumption of people like Klein and Thompson, who I'm sympathetic to in some ways, but I think that their focus on the policy piece really does overlook the fact that rhetorically, the liberal left in this country is just getting slaughtered. They are just absolutely getting killed because there's a nonstop propaganda machine arrayed against them, and people still haven't really come to grips with that, which they, would if they actually watched, some right-wing hate TV and radio for a bit.
Yeah, I was back in October. So right before the election, I was in Abilene, Kansas, which I had gone to. I had a conference in Kansas City, and so I'd gone out there to see the Eisenhower Library. And I'm a historian, so I'm interested in how these things are interpreted. Not surprisingly, it was really boring. But anyway, and this is also the home of Bob Dole, right? It should be said. So this little town has this unusual connection to the 20th century Republican Party. And, it was a Sunday and it's a really small town. So it wasn't really very much open in terms of lunch. And so I stopped at this little local restaurant, bar, whatever, to get a burger, whatever. And what did they have on TV there? It was not Fox News. It was O&M, or however you actually say it. Like, that's the norm. That's just like the background in Abilene, Kansas. Like, Fox News is the mainstream. If you're a conservative, you're probably not even watching Fox News that much. You're in this other world. Democrats are just, even people who are aware of how horrible the news is, like they're not aware of just where the fever swamps are like.
Oh, and it's not just the fever swamps and it's obviously, sort of extremist manifestations like Onan or whatever it's called. But did you see Mike Huckabee's message to Donald Trump 2 days ago, in which he basically was praying for an apocalypse, that he's the ambassador to Israel. And he was saying, I am your appointed servant, and basically talking in these just, a millennialist, apocalyptic, and frankly, insane.
And God has ordained you. Yeah.
Yeah. And and there's so many people on the liberal left who just simply refuse to believe that. They think that somebody like Huckabee's just on the grift, and maybe he is individually, but there's a huge number of people like him, including people in positions of power, who are not. They're not scamming. As our colleague Scott Lemieux has said on LGM many times, it would be a lot better if the Republican Party was just made up of scammers, and a venal businessmen who are trying to enrich themselves. But instead, you have a lot of true believer crazy people in positions of power, and a lot of them are very close to Donald Trump, who of course is just a complete void when it comes to actually believing anything, but who is surrounded by true believers who believe in genuinely nutty kind of stuff, which is intimately connected to the sort of historical nature of the American crazy, with a capital C. going back to, Richard Hofstadter and everybody else who sort of critiqued the paranoid style in American politics.
Yeah. Well, and I should mention that, since we're going live here, we will, if you're on YouTube, you can post comments and they can be shown on the screen here. So I'm going to just put up a comment from one of our viewers right now on YouTube. He was saying that is my question. Where are the extra political advocacy for the Democratic Party compared to the GOP? And you know what? That's a great question, Siriam, because it doesn't really exist. I mean, there's this endless discussion now about how are the Democrats going to create a Joe Rogan? Where's the Joe Rogan of the left? And of course, the answer is there isn't a single Joe Rogan of the right. The only reason that there is a Joe Rogan of the right is that there's all this entire ecosystem, and they throw all this money at it. And Joe Rogan is not appointed by the Republican Party. He's not controlled by them. He's not their messenger. He just says whatever he wants. And that type of democratic media environment is not something that the Democratic Party seems to want. That they don't understand. Look, you have to let people say their piece, and it's okay if they disagree with you. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I mean, there's the whole Rogan, this whole rhetoric, it really misses the point of what Joe Rogan is, why Joe Rogan is popular. I mean, it's a bunch of people who have never listened to Joe Rogan, right? And I don't really listen to him either because I'm not going to waste my time that way. But the idea that this is like, Joe Rogan was a comedian, right? And, I got into a lot of, I don't know, I mean, me and myself and the commenters that Lawyer Tons of Money don't necessarily have a very good relationship, but, I think that the reality is that the Democratic Party is not funny right now, right? I mean, like the politics of the party there's a puritanical nature to the party around a lot of the social issues, and it comes from a good place, right? A place of wanting justice and fairness and equality. And like, I get that, but it misses the boat on how you actually attract people, because most people they're not paying attention to things that we are paying attention to, right? This is not their world. And their world is listening to funny things. And like, being funny can mean also being offensive. And that's actually the root of Rogan, right? He became the guy who would say the thing that you're not really allowed to say, but he would say it. And this is what, drove his audience. And, you can't just recreate that. It's really about an attitude. I don't really know how to fix that. I don't think anybody knows how to fix that. But I don't think that the kind of social milieu of the contemporary Democratic Party is well set up for recreating the conditions to become like the hip and cool party again. That may change. I mean, that's going to change probably at some point due to factors beyond our control, but it's not something that you can just implement on top, at the very least, without probably billions of dollars and the understanding that you have to like let the seed money out there without actually controlling what the message is and being okay with most of these things failing until somebody figures out how to do it. But it's not something like Chuck Schumer or Ken Martin, for God's sake, is going to be able to sit down and like coordinate. It's going to come in some organic fashion.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Rogan in particular, I think, is a fascinating figure precisely because he's not really ideological at all. He's extraordinarily popular with young men in particular because he has this kind of sort of amiable stupidity that makes him attractive in terms of his just completely undisciplined eclecticism. So, I mean, the first sentence of a chapter in my book on stupidity, which I'll just read the sentence, is America in the age of Trump is Aaron Rodgers going on Joe Rogan to discuss the dangers of vaccines. Think for just a moment about the weapons grade level of stupidity packed into that sentence. And, Rogan himself calls himself a fucking moron. right? That's how he does. I'll quote him. I'm not a doctor. I'm a fucking moron. And I'm a cage fighting commentator who's a dirty stand-up comedian who just told you I'm drunk most of the time and I do testosterone and smoke a lot of weed. He told reporters after the CDC criticized him for telling his listeners that there was no good reason for young, healthy people to be vaccinated against COVID. But I'm not a respected source of information, even for me. Now, if the question is, how does the Democratic Party replicate that? I guess my follow-up question is, do you want to replicate that? I mean, is that what we need? Is that what we need? Is just some kind of, a self-confessed, drug addict moron going out there and just giving the people what they want because it's profitable? I don't know. This is not a rhetorical question. I'm genuinely struggling with this. I'll just put this within the context of academia. I would be confident that Erik, would agree, I think, with me that it's not the job of academics to be creating a useful platform for the Democratic Party. That's not what we do as academics, right? That's inimical to what we do as academics. Actually, the problem with Fox News is not really that it's conservative or right wing. It's that it's a bunch of hacks, who are completely in the tank for the Republican Party as an institution. So I think it's a genuinely difficult question to say, well, how do you construct a counter narrative to the right wing counter narrative without being, just what they have become, which is a bunch of hacks and people with no intellectual or moral integrity.
Yeah. And I don't think you can do it, right? I mean, Rogan is popular because he's entertaining, right? That's where it starts, is actually being entertaining. It doesn't start with the politics. It starts with the entertainment. And I don't know what Democrats could possibly do to recreate that. How would that even happen?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say, so as somebody who did work in right-wing media for about 10 years of my career, that, one thing that is very different about how they do things is that they're far more welcoming of new people. And that's something so in other words, Fox is routinely scouring the internet for people on social media, small-time bloggers, small-time writers, freelance writers, et cetera, to put them on the air and say, hey, tell us this thing that you found. Tell us the thing that you are outraged about that the left did to you.
Yeah. Meanwhile, what passes for Democratic Party media is the same people on MSNBC for 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. So these are direct experiences. And you can see just the contrast between the Tea Party movement and how it was totally embraced, and not just embraced, but encouraged and even paid for in some degrees by Fox News. They were literally paying for stages and having their personalities, like Glenn Beck. Glenn Beck was out there literally sponsoring Tea Party rallies, paying for them out of his own money, and getting people to come there and putting their leaders on the air and the people that showed up there. So, and then whereas you look at the No Kings rally, that obviously you look at the few overtly pro-democratic media that is out there, obviously they liked it, but they weren't telling people, hey, you should go out and do this, come to this rally in your area. They weren't doing that. And so there's this, that's the biggest difference between the right-wing media ecosystems, just from an economic standpoint, is there's a permanent jobs program on the right for anyone who wants to engage in media. You will have a job. They will pay you. And it doesn't matter how untalented or stupid that you are, they've got a spot for you. And there's nothing remotely like that on the left. And so as a result, we lose, hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people every year that would love to advocate for our values and to, oppose the right-wing media in a way that is effective to the common, people of this day and age, wherever they happen to be and whatever their demographic is. But they can't do it because the Democrats, they want one Joe Rogan replacement, and they want nothing else. That's the unfortunate reality.
Well, I can speak to one particular place where you can see how this has worked in the most sort of egregious sorts of ways, is within American law schools. Because for the last 45 years, there's been an organized effort, a very organized and extremely well-funded effort on the part of the right to construct this apparatus for generating these, essentially reactionary, authoritarian types of judges through the Federalist Society. And if you're a law student, your odds of getting like a good clerkship or like a high status job within the political infrastructure of America are about 10 times higher if you go the right-wing route than if you go the left-wing liberal route, simply because of a supply and demand phenomenon, right? And so it's really, really striking to see that how anybody who has like sort of careerist aspirations within the legal sphere has a tremendous impetus to essentially sell themselves out if they don't have a sincere commitment to the values of the Republican Party. I've seen a lot of careers made that way, both in the judiciary and in academia, because there is a massive, well-funded propaganda apparatus to support right-wing ideas and right-wing political power in this country in a way that there just isn't really on except in this very amorphous way on the liberal left.
Yeah. Well, actually, so we have a viewer follow up on something that Erik said. John says that on Erik's point about Joe Rogan being entertaining and being tough to replicate, it strikes me that isn't that different from conservative attempts to replicate The Daily Show. And that's actually right, John. Rush Limbaugh, in many ways, in fact, was doing the exact same thing. His entire shtick was he will say the things that you're not allowed to say. Like that was the whole point of saying dittos, Rush, was people saying, yes, I'm glad you're out there and you're saying what I believe and you're making me feel like I'm not insane for believing these things. And well, they kind of were, but yeah, like there is definitely that I think that's a great point. But if you want to respond to that, Erik, or
only that, you're right. It's the. If you remember, the attempt by Fox News to have, the Greg Gutfield comedy hour.
Oh, they're still doing it.
Oh, are they still doing it? Yeah, well, I know he's been on tour. And I confess to being vaguely curious to attend this just to see what the hell happens. I actually think it would be good for a lot of us to actually attend right-wing events occasionally, just so liberals actually knew what was going on. Yeah, he's not funny. The only way he's remotely could be considered funny is if you think that, like, I don't know, gay people or it's hilarious that people are gay. It's just like, but it doesn't work as comedy, right? It works as propaganda to people who are already propagandized, but it certainly did not have the impact that The Daily Show had. So, yeah, I agree with that basically.
Yeah. Well, and let's go to another viewer comment here. And we've already shared one of his before, Sirium. I hope I'm not saying that wrong here, so you can let me know. But he mentions that Joe Rogan's MMA background cannot be ignored here. And I think that there is something there that, for a long time, both of the parties, had a predominantly there were that men voted more for Republicans and women voted more for Democrats, and that has become more lopsided. In 2024, Donald Trump won a majority of Hispanic men, as a matter of fact, and that hadn't happened, I think, forever. That it maybe since Ronald Reagan, maybe he won. I actually don't. I should have looked that demographic up. But as far as I know, a Republican, with the one asterisk potential exception of Ronald Reagan in '84, hasn't won Hispanic men ever. And I think that there's something there that Democrats haven't figured out how is it that they can support the equal rights for women and women's empowerment in society in a way that also is not detrimental to men.
Well, yeah, a lot of men don't like attacks on patriarchy for the same reason that a lot of plutocrats don't like capital gains taxes, right? It's not surprising that you get this backlash among male voters when you have even relatively mild attempts to push back against traditional forms of gender discrimination. And that's that's just a fundamental political dynamic, similar to in its own ways, to the kind of dynamic that arose with the Southern strategy, in the post 1960s American political context, in which you lost a lot of Dixiecrat voters because suddenly the Democratic Party wasn't going to be an overtly racist party anymore. And the Democratic Party isn't going to be an overtly sexist party, and the Republican Party is going to be an overtly sexist party. And so you have to win that battle. You have to win the battle over the underlying arguments about sex and gender and gender equality, because it is a real battle. And there's a lot of men, especially a lot of young men, who obviously feel that like any kind of even mild feminism is a sort of status degradation for them, which is why I think part of the reason you see this tremendous kind of shift towards the right among young men in particular, because that's where the gap is really huge. If you look at the gap among young voters, voters under 30, I believe there was a 24-point gender gap between men and women vis-a-vis of Trump and Harris. And I think, that is a reflection of a huge problem. And it's a problem that's also reflected in things like the whole incel phenomenon and everything that, goes with that, with all of these very alienated young men who feel that society is screwing them over because it's becoming way too hostile to them and favorable to women, which, I think a description of even a mildly feminist agenda will be translated that way within the context of a traditional sort of patriarchal frame.
And I also think, I guess one thing that's to shift this slightly, because again, I think that, the responses to Trump are very much related to, again, they just reflect how you felt before. And I think that you have this desire on the left to have this kind of like class over race, or class is the real identity that people experience. And that if we just focused on this, that everybody would kind of come together and, defeat the plutocrats. The problem with this is that it flies in the face of every piece of American history, right? There's just no evidence that this really exists. And I think that this description of the way that men are responding to really relatively slight critiques about misogyny and feminism, misogyny and male supremacy, is an example of this, right? I mean, like the same with race is that people feel these things very, very strongly. And we know that they act on these things, and they may feel class that strongly, but the historical evidence of people acting on that over their identities around race, their identities around gender, their identities around religion, it doesn't really be confirmed empirically by the evidence from 250 years of American history. And I think that that's something that the left has to get itself around too, that taking these issues of race and gender as seriously as they want to take class has to be a centerpiece, because you're actually, by kind of making these claims, you're flying in the face of the lived experience of the people you're trying to organize, whether they are the people who are the racists and sexists who you realize at some point you need to draw them into your coalition, or it's the people experiencing the racism and sexism who are not necessarily going to be inclined to listen to somebody who's dismissing their personal experiences. So I think that there's a lot, as we think about the larger impact of Trumpism, I think, again, there are some serious conversations that need to have across the political spectrum about this.
Yeah, and one thing I would add there, Eric, is that I think it's very much a professional deformation of sort of left liberal academics in particular, that they don't appreciate that if you ask, say, the average American to say what race is, or to say what gender is, or to say what religion is, you'll probably get a reasonably coherent kind of answer. If you ask them to say what class is, a lot of people really have only the very vaguest sense of what that term, could even possibly mean, outside of like this, axiom that basically everybody who's slightly, poorer than Jeff Bezos and slightly richer than a homeless person is middle class, right? That's about how far the analysis goes. And I think it's a professional deformation on the part of the liberal left that many of us do not appreciate, that class is far from a transparent or intuitive concept in American culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Not to mention the century plus of propaganda around this to push that class is not, actually a real thing in America.
Right.
Yeah, and actually, and I would say specifically that's something that Erik and I talked about when he was on my show a few months ago. That with unions, the decline of unions, they were in many ways the sort of intermediary institution for people, the preservation of collective memory of what class struggle looks like, and who you are respective to your boss, and that you have more in common with people who look differently than you and might live in the another part of town than you. That in fact your interests are the same, because
right. And also this ties in back to the point about the right-wing scream machine. I mean, you basically have this gigantic propaganda apparatus that's trying to define Marxism as thinking maybe we ought to have a graduated income tax, right? I mean, that it makes it extremely difficult to have any kind of coherent discussion about class-related issues.
Yeah, well, and that again, does speak to the fact that we just need a lot more media. There has to be a lot more investment in this. If the Democratic powers that be, they spend all this money on TV ads. They spend over $1 billion between Kamala Harris's campaign and the various outside groups in 2024, and they have this idea. Well, we can show that it moved these people here for this many. When we showed them this in the poll, it changed their mind. But that's a controlled setting, and it's based on self-reporting. And anybody, this is, to me, what is so bizarre is that the Democratic Party, has these deep connections with academic social scientists, many of them, right? But one of the basic things of social science is self-reporting is unreliable, and that it's influenced, by the circumstances in which you ask the question. And that's why in psychology, you can't. There's a difference between asking somebody a question in a clinical environment and asking, and finding their opinion somehow in some other way, and that people know that self-reporting is just not as reliable, and so. And then, and again, even if somehow it could change their their viewpoint in that 5 minutes after you showed them that, fine. Let's grant that that's possible, right? But then they go and are deluged by, 50 Facebook posts and, 20 Instagram posts and, and 2 hours of YouTube telling them that, the aliens are controlling the Democratic Party. How is that? You're not offsetting any of that. With a 5-minute TV ad.
Right. And I mean, I think that there's also, we see this at LGM all the time in our comments where, you have these outraged and angry people who are right to be outraged and angry about what's going on around them. But they're like, well, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris had this policy about this thing. I'm like, nobody knows what that is. Right? I don't even know what their specific policy positions were on X issue. I mean, I more or less know, but there's this kind of liberal belief that if you one thing liberals have to get over, I think this is really important, is educating people is not a political strategy. Relying on information that is true and accurate is not a political strategy. Having good policy positions in your platform is not a political strategy. And it's amazing to me how often people go back to this well, Joe Biden, may want to do this slight change to the earned income tax credit that would make a difference for 8% of Americans. And I'm just like, what are you talking about? Nobody cares. And if you're not starting your politics at the center point of understanding how to communicate to the people who actually have to vote for you, you've already lost.
Yeah, that is a really great point. Yeah, and it's, in a certain sense, I think it is a natural viewpoint for people who are political professionals or political junkies to have the viewpoint that you're arguing against there, Erik, because we want to believe that people know and care about these issues that we are as passionate about as we are, and we just have to accept they're not. Well, and you're abnormal.
Well, let me if I can say one thing here, if there's one thing that we need to learn from Trump, it's that our vision of what America is wrong, right? Everything we think about this country that is good is wrong. Americans have proven this, right? They have proven it over and over again that your vision of what a good, liberal, educated America is an incorrect vision of America. And just because the people believe in this does not mean you can win this way. And if you don't, again, like it's the same with the media, you have to, and this is why I keep calling, like we have to almost restart our political positioning. If you don't start with the position, or let me put it this way, if you do start with a position that America is made up of people who America is not in fact made up of, again, you are going to lose. And that's where Democrats remain.
I would just sort of here just reference something that I've talked about quite a bit on the blog, which is something I call the Ariana Grande theory of politics, which is not in any way a slight on Ms. Grande, who I understand is a very strong Democratic supporter.
And it should say a releaser of excellent albums.
Yes, and a releaser of excellent, which the reason it's a metaphor that I use to describe the fact that I knew like about two things about Ariana Grande, but I had like a comprehensive knowledge of like mid-70s pop music. And the point of the analogy was my knowledge of American politics is kind of like my knowledge of 70s pop music, and the American marginal voters' knowledge of American politics is like my knowledge of Ariana Grande, i.e. basically non-existent. And those are the people whose votes you have to get. And it's a very unfortunate reality, but the marginal American voter doesn't really know anything about anything policy-wise. And if you're trying to win that person's vote by getting into even mildly technical policy discussions, you're forget it, man, because you don't even want to contemplate what they don't know. And as Erik was saying, what Trump has demonstrated more than anything else is a complete shamelessness in his willingness to take advantage of that. And that's a huge problem, to have, it's a big problem for the theory of democracy that the marginal voter is a moron, but the marginal voter is a moron. Now, I realize that's not a successful campaign strategy, but I'm not here to like formulate like messaging strategies for Democratic politicians, right? We're here, I think, for the purposes of trying to do some kind of deeper analysis of what it is that we're up against. And what we're up against is that people don't have the faintest idea what they're talking about, right? Because, for the same reason that I would lose like, a 100-point like tennis match with Carlos Alcaraz 100-0, right? The marginal voter is me playing tennis against Carlos Alcaraz, right? It's like, it's no contest, and we cannot move forward on the basis of a theory that we're going to turn me into a better tennis player, to sort of extend the analogy, right? We have to figure out how to win that person's vote, even if that person doesn't even know what the three parts of the government are, according to Schoolhouse Rock.
Yeah, or who the vice president is. Because, like about 15% of Americans consistently have no idea who the vice president is. Some of them think that it's the previous one who is the vice president. So no, these are all great points. All right, well, we're just over an hour here, so but this has been a great discussion, guys, and I appreciate everybody in the audience for joining us. We had a lot of nice participation from the audience. And I've got the URL for the Flux website. So if you like this discussion, you can visit us over at flux.community. And obviously, both of our guests here, Erik and Paul, you can visit them at Lawyers, Guns, Money blog. It's blog on the end, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I always forget. Yeah. But yeah. And so, but did you guys have any final thoughts that you wanted to say before we sign off here? Why don't you go ahead, Erik? Since I
don't know. Only that I just urge people to read their history, and in a very real way, not in a way that is like just going to reinforce your prior beliefs. To really dig into what America is. This is a kind of a time to do that, to start rethinking about what, how we're going to remake this country. And also, I think I would just urge everybody to quit thinking that you're right. And that includes myself. I mean, I've tried to rethink all kinds of things, but your beliefs about politics, I think in my own have been proven wrong. Part of what I'm doing is not just telling people what to do. It's to work through my own mistakes, and the incorrect vision of America that I had. And I think that the more we can do that right now, especially 3 years before the next presidential election, this is the time to have those conversations. 2030 is, or 2028 is not the time to have those conversations. 2025 is.
Yeah, I just would say that recently I reread Orwell's 1984, and it struck me that when he wrote that book between like 1945 and 1948, he was looking back on a world that had just been a complete catastrophe for the previous 30 years. And I think if he could have seen what would have happened over the next 80 years, he would have been shocked by how well things have gone overall, despite, needless to say, all the massive problems that the world faces. And so I guess I would just want to end on a note of optimism in that regard, in that, I think what we're really reaping now are the fruits of having had so many decades of relative stability and relative economic growth and progression in terms of basic social justice issues, that a lot of people have just gotten used to the idea that things like expertise and wealth and moral progress and everything like that is just the natural order of the world. And if Donald Trump proves one thing, it's that that's not true, right? And that the demons are always there in the background that have to be fought back. And that's the task of the present moment. But we should approach it with a certain degree of optimism.
Yeah. All right. Well, great. Thank you for that, Paul, and thank you, Erik. And if you guys like that, this episode, live episode, you should join us again, and we'll be doing this again in the weeks to come. So thanks a lot for joining us, and I'm Matthew Sheffield, and we'll see you next time.